talk about building momentum across the spectrum of state policy approaches. So please join me in welcoming Tamar Todd, Representative Alex Dominguez, and Representative LaShawn Ford. Thank you so much.
Okay, welcome everybody. So Graham's presentation, I think, was a great intro to the afternoon because the rest of the panels this afternoon are going to focus on this state policy pathway, of which there's really two routes to enacting reform. One is through the ballot initiative process, which we've seen in Oregon and Colorado, and there's a session on both Oregon and on Colorado this afternoon where you'll get to dive more deeply into that ballot initiative process and the outcomes. And in that process, we get to choose what the policy looks like when we're enacting it and put forward something that can be as aggressive as the voters are willing to embrace and as comprehensive as they're willing to embrace. The other route, of which we've seen an explosion of in the past year or two across the country, is state lawmakers through state legislatures enacting a whole variety of reforms that are contained within this state pathway that Graham presented, but are differentiate a lot in the approach they take in terms of what they do, how they tackle the issue, how far they go. Some are embracing something similar to regulated access that we've seen in Colorado and Oregon. Some are decriminalization, or a step further, maybe the complete removal of penalties for personal use, but without a commercial regulated access piece. Some are trying to expand right to try laws that exist within their state already, and some are funding research and are actually, I think, complementary to the FDA route. So I think there's a way that they're two separate pathways, but they also can be aligned and complement each other in a number of ways. So on this panel today, we're lucky enough to have two state lawmakers from Texas and Illinois to talk about the legislation in their states and what they've been working on. And we're also going to hear via video from California from Senator Scott Wiener about the decriminalization of personal use bill that is currently in the state legislature there. So first I want to introduce our speakers, then we'll hear from Senator Wiener, and then they'll talk each specifically about their bill, and then I'll ask them some questions and hopefully open it up for some audience questions as well. So first we have Representative Alex Dominguez from Texas, former representative from Texas, and he has worked in multiple states on a variety of tackling innovative approaches to mental health, including through psychedelics. Is one of his passions, and he focused his time in the state legislature on addressing the needs of the underserved, forgotten, and often ignored. And one of the centerpieces of that work was HB 1802, which was the first of its kind legislation that funded a study on the efficacy of psychedelics for treatment-resistant veterans from PTSD. So we'll hear from him about that. And then we're also lucky to have today Representative LaShawn Ford from Illinois, from the 8th District in Illinois. He also is focused on helping those in need. He's focused on social justice issues, disparities in employment, education, and the healthcare system. And he introduced HB 1 in Illinois, which establishes, or would establish a regulated psychedelic therapy program for Illinois. So quite comprehensive. Okay, and now we're going to hear first from Senator Scott Wiener, who's state senator in California. He introduced legislation last year to decriminalize psychedelics. He reintroduced it this year. It's SB 58. It's passed through the Senate, and it's now currently in the Assembly. And we're going to see him via video first.
Hi everyone, I'm Scott Wiener. I have the honor of representing San Francisco and part of San Mateo County in the California State Senate, and it's an honor to virtually be with you today. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. It sounds like a fantastic conference, and I want to thank you for all the work that you're all doing to try to move towards a smarter and actual science-based and fact-based drug policy around psychedelics, to move away from the war on drugs, which has been a failure, and to acknowledge that these substances have a lot of benefits, including benefits around behavioral health. So thank you for your work. Here in California, we are trying, and I am currently pursuing legislation, Senate Bill 58, to decriminalize the possession and use of plant and mushroom-based psychedelics. We've been trying for a few years to get this passed. It's always more complicated than it should be, but we were able to get this bill passed through the state Senate, and we're now in the Assembly. We have a great coalition of veterans and others who deeply understand on a very personal level the benefits of access to psychedelics. We have a lot of challenges ahead. We know that even with cannabis, after all these years in so many states legalizing cannabis, the federal government is still not really on board. And so we all need to lock arms and fight very hard at the state level and also at the federal level to just move past this era of arresting and locking people up for using drugs, which is a health issue. It's not a criminal justice issue, and psychedelics is definitely part of that equation. So thank you so much for all you do, and have a wonderful, wonderful conference.
All right, you can't hear us, but thank you, Senator Wiener. Okay, would like to go first to you, Representative Dominguez, to talk a little bit about HB 1802, and maybe, obviously tell us about what it was about, but maybe why you made the choice to pursue that policy approach as opposed to some of the others, and the process for introducing it and getting it enacted.
Well, sure. You may have heard that Texas is a red state. We can't even get a cannabis bill to get a hearing, much less a vote in the Texas Senate. So you can imagine how people might react to somebody pushing a psychedelics bill. There were a number of people that I believe can benefit from the healing properties of psychedelic medicines. But I had to find a demographic that I knew my fellow members of the House and those in the Senate, in addition to the governor, if possible, that they would find palatable to accept that this group needed help, and they needed help right now. Texas being one of the states with the largest veterans population, seemed like an easy group to think about, especially when we confront the statistics that nationwide, since 9/11, we lose about 20 veterans every day to suicide. That's a number that no fellow member of the House can ignore, and that's why we chose them, even though we'll speak a little bit more about the other groups that we think will benefit from this research.
Okay, thank you so much. And Representative Ford, HB1, so that's a very different model to go for a whole comprehensive regulatory program. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to pursue that model and the process for introducing it and what's happened since introduction?
Yeah, I tell you, I'm happy to be here in the Mile High City, and congratulations to you all for winning the title, and it's just great to be here. And I'm happy to be a part of the breakthrough. And my constituents, they go everywhere to make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. So in Illinois, we have two people right here, Cole and Jean. They're here making sure that I say all the right things and that I go to all the right rooms, because they help write the legislation. And so our legislation in Illinois happens to be the #1 bill in the state of Illinois. So it's House Bill 1, and we talk about removing it from the scheduled drug list. We talk about making sure that we allow for people to be licensed to provide the therapy. We decrim, and we do everything that we can so that people can get the help that they need. And it came to me from constituent base. I knew nothing about this help that's available for veterans and people with PTSD and people with life-ending diseases. So I'm all in, and the governor of Illinois is progressive, and Jean and the team, we're working to make sure that the governor does everything he can to pass it in Illinois.
Great. Thank you for your work on it so far. I wanted to ask, so my experience on working on the state legislation is that this issue has been a little bit different than some others I've worked on. One, it's definitely more bipartisan. You have support from both sides. It also, for the first time, you actually show up to a lobby visit and change the person's mind in the process, so they or voting differently after you leave them before, which never happens on any other issue. And so I'm curious from your experience as lawmakers in the introduction of this, is it different for you than other policies you've worked on? And if so, in what ways has working on this issue been different or the same?
You know, in some ways, I fought for and passed a number of bills to help veterans. So many of the same coalitions were supportive of House Bill 1802, but it also was a bit different because this isn't a typical, coffee table, dinner table discussion with folks. In Texas, we don't talk about mushrooms unless they're on your pizza. And this was a very different topic, and for many representatives, a scary one to do out loud. So it definitely was a lot of work. In that case, it's not unlike most of the bills in Texas. We filed 6,000 bills during session, and if we can get through 800 of them, we had a good year.
Yeah. Rep. Dominguez, thank you for the work that you've done in this space. It's made our job easier in Illinois, and it's all about educating. That's what we have to be able to convey, that this is the right thing to do, and debunk some of the myths from the 60s about how this is bad for society. And we've run into nothing but positive interactions. It's very hard to find people that are against it, but there are people that are at a certain age that remember the myths and the things that people experienced from the 60s, that we have to educate them about the actual truths about the therapy.
And I guess that leads into another question that I'm curious about. So with the ballot initiatives and the state legislation, there's obviously a role of people in the community and activists, and on this issue, really a strong place for researchers who take place in the conversation and present information and testimony. So I'm curious on your thoughts of first of all, what kind of coalition was built for each of your bills? And then what were some of the most effective ways that people were able to help advocate for that legislation? And I'll add to that also things that were ineffective that may have been intended to be effective. What was useful, and what kind of coalitions did you build?
Well, if I can start, if you heard Governor Perry speak this morning, this is the bill he was talking about. I filed this bill as a bit of a larger shell bill to discuss multiple types of psychedelics to be included in the study. And on a Friday afternoon, I get a call from a lobbyist who asked, would I be interested in taking a call or a Zoom with Governor Perry? And I'm looking around thinking someone's trying to prank me. Here's Governor Perry. I'm a Democrat. What does he want to talk to me about? I've never heard of this. And sure enough, we had our conversation, and he was talking about this bill. And he tells me the story of the Latrell brothers and how that impacted his life. Really impacted his life. Governor Perry hadn't been back in the capital of Texas for 5 years. But through him saying he would support this bill if we did it the right way, we got together with Dr. Lynette Averill of the Baylor College of Medicine, Marcus and Amber Capone of VETS, who are also here as well. We have Ben Unger, we have Adam Marr of Warrior Angels. We built a coalition of people that have gone through psychedelic treatment for healing, and research scientists who could speak with scientific expertise. The others could explain the experience to lawmakers. Like I said before, I wasn't expecting it, and I was hoping for maybe a hearing. But once we knew this coalition was on board, we've got a shot.
Yeah, and in Illinois, we built a coalition of universities, people with lived experience, veterans, our state agencies. It's all in for us because the movement is that laws should not prevent people from living their best life. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we allow for this and not let laws get in the way of that. And so we have a strong coalition of people that's silent to a degree, but calling Jane and myself saying, we have to do this. It's unbelievable. I have people actually working in the pharmaceutical community actually calling saying, we support this legislation. And that's huge for the pharmaceutical industry to call privately to say, we're not gonna get in the way, that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I don't know if it's like that nationally, did you have that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, interesting. And did either of your bills face opposition, even openly or murmurs of opposition?
You know, we had some opposition about people who are philosophically opposed to government funding things, just in general. But we were able to, in many ways, neutralize them and at least get them to stay on the sidelines. Honestly, one of the most difficult groups that we had to try to talk down were people that wanted to be helpful. And I say this knowing the history of cannabis legislation in Texas. I know a lot of people that were like, we need to decrim all psychedelics. And we're like, that's a non-starter in Texas. That's not going to happen. You'll kill my bill in 5 minutes. So we talked to them and they said, what can we do? So you're going to be part of the conversation. We need you. But we also want to have a hearing that is clean and straight to the point so that the members that are on the dais asking questions are not going to be held in a negative light back in their home districts, where they might be a little bit more conservative than in Austin, Texas. So we needed to help them help us, and they did. And I think in many ways, speaking with activists, speaking with advocates, we can work together knowing that the political dynamics, I'm sure every state's a little bit different, but I know in Texas, we had to work together, and sometimes that meant just we're all gonna just stay silent for a little bit. We'll all celebrate afterwards if we do this right.
Yeah, and so the people there is some opposition from people that object to all sin things like gambling and any drugs, cannabis, whether it's mushrooms, whatever. Those are the people that we find that's going to be against it no matter what. But the majority of the population, they're open to learning. This is something that people really want to know more about, and they know people that's actually been helped with the use of it. And so that makes it even easier for us to have these conversations on both sides of the aisle.
Mm-hmm. You mean so people who have like a friend or a loved one who has a direct positive experience and then conveys that to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And then when Oprah comes out and supports it, that makes it even easier.
Then everyone has a friend who's had a positive. Right. And so did you see any, I mean, probably not with the research bill, but maybe did you see any, or have you seen any organized law enforcement opposition of law enforcement groups? Are they in the category of opposing everything, or they've stood down?
We actually had, they couldn't drop a card. A card in Texas means a letter of support. We couldn't do that officially, but privately they would tell first responders that they also have been suffering PTSD, many of them. We don't think of it, but think of the ambulance or the firefighters, those drivers who rescue somebody or lose a team member due to an emergency, or the police officer who has been shot or who has shot someone, that they are suffering as well, and they're supportive of this. And since the passing of 1802, more and more have been coming forward, and that's always a good thing.
Yeah, and if we could get the feds to help, that would be great. But if we could decriminalize in Illinois and in other states, the law enforcement, they will sort of turn a blind eye. They're going to follow the law of the state. And in Illinois, our goal is to make it therapy. And I think that law enforcement, they probably won't slip in support, but they won't be against it because it will be something that's used in medical settings and it's controlled.
Or it's very regulated.
And it's regulated, yes.
So it's less scary for them.
You're right.
Okay. I'm curious on you just mentioned in passing the federal government piece, and that was something Graham touched on as well, that, the funding research is complementary to maybe what the federal government's gonna do, or FDA. On the regulated access, you're talking about something where the state law is gonna be, state penalties are gonna be removed, but it's gonna be in violation of federal law. Has that come up as an issue that folks have raised, or they're used to it from cannabis and don't think about it anymore?
Exactly.
Where is it in terms of the conversation?
It's the same, that's what law enforcement will look to, just like cannabis. But you know what? I think that we're seeing now that states have rights, and if they pass it, law enforcement would be fine. They're not going to go out and arrest people for something that their state has already decriminalized. So states, until the feds could come along, I think it's great that states like Colorado, have done this to lead the way.
Okay, so we'll set an example perhaps
Yeah.
for others, or they'll watch to see what the federal government does here.
And someone spoke about it, that it's a good example of more states doing it, helping the feds push closer to doing what we need them to do.
Okay, that makes sense. I want to actually go back quickly to a question, and in a few minutes I'll open it up to the audience questions too, that I raised first that was about deciding on the model of approach, and that was something that Graham had talked about as well. This issue really is an example of the laboratories of experimentation, especially since there's really a broad variety of models and types of legislation that states are moving forward to learn from and see how much is, so it doesn't sound like there was very organized opposition against what you eventually introduced, but how much do you think it was shaped, what model you said we couldn't do decrim of all psychedelics, that's a no-go in Texas, so is a lot of the model chosen in a state to proceed legislatively as a decision about what's going to be at all politically viable, what kind of coalition can I build, and then you adjust your goal towards that?
So, in hoping to broaden the conversation about psychedelics, not just in Texas, and I mean this in the most humble ways, we were shooting for the moon. We thought if we can pass a bill on the topic of psychedelic treatment, this might start a national conversation outside of the West Coast. And I don't know that this is a red state solution, but certainly a red state approach. And we thought, what is the group that we can all say we support at every campaign stump speech that we're going to give? And I'm speaking of all the members that are running for office. They're all going to say, and I support the vets. We've had, until recently, active duty personnel overseas for the past 20 years. Eventually, they're going to come home. And they're going to come home scarred. This group, we knew, had advocates in the community. And when those advocates met up with us, we're talking about vets, warrior angels, the VFW got with us. We crafted the language so it was going to be extremely difficult for somebody to publicly say, I am not going to support this bill, even though I know this might lead to saving veteran lives. I needed to make it just hard for them to vote no. And it worked. And that also neutralized a lot of potential opposition because we made it hard. And that was entirely intentional. And I think that's what we had to do in Texas. To my surprise, when we took it to the floor for a vote, it passed nearly unanimously. It flew through the Senate. So I think when you're careful with your language, your policy language, and its intended purpose, we knew we could do it this way. And then we could have that next conversation next session. And maybe the feds start taking notice of what's happening in all these states, and they can also pick up, where we left off.
Yeah, I think that I think Gene and the groups in Illinois, we've been deliberate about bringing people along. We have 78 members in the House, take 60 to pass a bill. We believe with those numbers, we could probably pass a bill and get 60 votes. But our goal is to make sure that people, you got unanimous. We would love to have that. We don't want to have opposition when we put it on the board because that's not as healthy as passing it with everyone in support. So our goal is to bring people along, educate individuals, and make sure that if people are opposed, they are opposed because of religious beliefs or other things like that, but not being opposed for reasons that's not true.
Or like a lack of understanding.
A lack of understanding, yes.
Okay. Well, that actually leads into my final question, then I'll open it up for the audience, which is about implementation and planning for implementation. So I'm really impressed that both of your bills involves the state spending money, which in my experience, it's a lot easier to pass something that makes the state money than asks them to spend money. And I know some of the pure decrim models out there are maybe a reflection on, the difficulty of getting the state legislature to invest in a program or spend money. So what are the thoughts, and then also just how complicated, especially on a regulated access bill, implementation will be. And the panels this afternoon, one on Oregon and one in Colorado, demonstrate the multi-year process and what's involved in that. So is part of the discussion in the passage of the bill what will happen in implementation, and like what's the buy-in and support by the whatever the regulatory agency is going to be on that piece, and even like the licensing boards and medical community on seeing it successfully implemented once it happens.
So we were lucky to partner with the Baylor College of Medicine, and they also are already approved by the DEA to handle Schedule I controlled substances. So we thought this would be a pretty quick implementation. Little did we know the actual contract negotiations, way above my pay grade. Took a little bit longer to get the ball rolling. Thankfully, the study's well underway. But had I known that back then, I would have worked that into the funding structure. And at the same time, we're extremely grateful that the state of Texas paid for this. And that's fantastic. Knowing that after us, other states can at least request for the same amount, if not more and more. And I think that's where this will go for other states as well.
Yeah. Well, we're looking for ways to generate revenue, but we have our state agencies on board, making sure the revenue department, making sure the Department of Professional Regulators are on board. What is the governor's office? He controls all of the agencies, but they're going to be agriculture, everyone will be on board. In fact, we also have our Med Society on board, making sure that we do everything right, at least to our understanding, because there's always going to be someone to say you missed something.
Right.
But we're available to catch it.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, I'd like to, I know there's 2 microphones, so I did want to open it up for questions from the audience. My only little lecture thing will be if there's people behind you waiting to ask a question, don't give a speech, make your question quick, let them answer, so that everyone who wants to ask a question has a chance.
Hi, my name is Faison. I'm a medical student at Emory University in Atlanta. It's super inspiring to see red states actually take up stances. What advice, or how would you broker a relationship with someone in the Georgia Assembly to actually kind of take on some of these types of issues? Using Georgia as an example, but what advice would you have? Yeah.
You know, we actually had a conversation with a couple of assemblymen from the state of Georgia shortly after we passed our bill. This must have been maybe about a month or 2 afterwards. And since then, my former staff and the current group that I'm with now, Texans for Greater Mental Health, we've been actually giving advice to other red states. There is a desire in red states by conservative policymakers to pass this type of legislation. And we've certainly given them all our resources. We've connected them with the advocates and researchers that we have. For example, in Kentucky, we connected Dr. Lynette Averill with the Attorney General's policy team, and that I think is leading for Kentucky doing a similar type of treatment solution. So the willingness is there. I think the approach has to be bring a coalition of folks with you when you approach them. You know, this is so-and-so. This is how we think they can benefit from this. Let me tell you what this treatment is. That's it.
Maybe we'll go to this side.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm the director of the Victoria Association of Psychedelic Studies over on Vancouver Island, Canada. We're in a very unique legal situation right now with a lot of things being decriminalized, but also impossible to access for patients. And I'm wondering, you know, a lot of what we suspect in Canada as being one of the driving forces against psychedelic medicine access is pharmaceutical interest. Not that we have a lobby system the same way, but how do you see managing lobbyists and corporate interests and that affecting the nuances of access to care for people, especially vulnerable people who are poor?
That's what Illinois is all about, making sure. That's been something that we, and I heard this previous speaker talk about, what's his name, Graham. He was talking about equity and making sure that no one's left out, everyone has the ability to afford it. That's important to me, being in a minority population and watching how certain populations are left out of, clinical trials left out of medicines that's helpful. So that's front and center in our discussions in Illinois. Thank you for that.
Now, if we can add on to that, we shouldn't think of the pharmaceutical industry as an enemy. We could see them in many ways helping. They do have substantial resources to lobby, say, at the federal level. And of course, they want a piece of some type of patent, I'm sure, in the future. But at the same time, if we can balance that with the natural approach of finding the treatment, whether it's psilocybin or something else, we are still expanding the conversation. Now it's no longer should we, the question is what's the model going to be? And I think that's a win for everyone in this room.
Thank you, Representative Ford, Representative Dominguez, for coming here and leading the charge in both our state, but in Texas. It's awesome to see Texas embrace freedom as well. That's right. I'll keep my question short, and I don't want you both to devote too much airtime to it. I'm just honestly curious. I've been to conferences like this for education. Representative Ford, you mentioned different conferences, and they're all really boring. My short question is, what is it like to come to a conference like this?
It's the best.
Cole, I have to tell you, this is the best. I've been elected 17 years, and this has got to be a focused, united front, and you can't beat that.
I accidentally tried to register for the ophthalmologist conference at the hotel across the street. The people looked a lot more boring.
Right?
Hi, thank you guys for being here. My name is Lana. I'm a licensed clinician, actually in the state of Colorado. And my background is in traumatic stress, and I've developed traumatic stress programs for veterans and first responders, and I'm hoping to incorporate psychedelics. So I'm a big supporter of that community, and it's a big piece of my work. And I also understand why starting with that community is sort of, I don't want to say it like this, but the low-hanging fruit, because everybody can get behind it. What I want to know is there really a plan for expanding it beyond veterans and first responders, and how is that going to be implemented?
So I'm hoping to get back to this Texas legislature next session, and that's the next step. And by then our findings should be in. And even this past session, we're working on riders to expand this study as well. But we think you're right, that the people that are going to potentially benefit from this type of treatment, it's not just the veterans, it's not just first responders, it's the sexual assault survivor, it's somebody who was in an accident, somebody who suffered a TBI, traumatic brain injury. A lot of different people can benefit. So until the feds really get their act together, we can keep increasing our studies and get more people to at least, to some level, benefit from it. At the same time, we can hopefully start training more people like yourself so they can find the methodology of what works best, and maybe what works best, which treatment, is it MDMA for this type of situation? Because this is data we don't have yet. And we think by having these types of studies, we can give this to the feds. FDA, here you go, we're putting it on a silver platter for you. Start descheduling or start declaring more things, breakthrough therapies. Help us help other people. The data's here.
Thank you.
Hello, representatives. Thank you for being here. My question is primarily to Representative Ford. I'm from Chicago, originally born in Baghdad, Iraq. I was there during the 90s when there was a bombed, and obviously suffered a lot of trauma because of it. The psychedelics have helped me get past my treatment-resistant depression and PTSD, and it really showed me that I was really passionate about the world of psychedelics, and I wanted to hear from you, Representative Ford, how someone like me, a fellow Chicagoan who really hasn't been in the industry much, can be involved and help push your agenda and make it a reality.
Yeah, thank you for your service, and there's the card. And we look forward to that. Was easy, right?
Real quick, yeah.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Dr. Lisa Price from Seattle, Washington. And as you all know, Washington State was very, very close to passing legislation, and we're still working on it. The legislation was actually kind of gutted down to a pilot study, so that will be conducted at the University of Washington My question is, in Texas, what happens next after in legislative terms, what happens next after the study? Does it go, do you think it'll go to a working group, or how will that information be used and what will happen next?
I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, part of the reason why I'm here at the conference is also to speak with other policymakers, see what's working in other states. We would like this to expand from its current group of just veterans to include other folks, and to create whether it's a regulatory framework or some type of treatment framework. You know, we know that ketamine can be used to treat people now. We are hoping that MDMA is maybe next on the horizon, but we knew we needed to get information to get psilocybin to be used for the treatment of PTSD, for example. So we're trying to do two things. One, we're trying to help the feds. Two, we're trying to help Texans. And that is going to be next session. We filed at least one gigantic bill to take this that next level, possibly with a couple of other bills and some riders that provide funding for what we're already doing, and maybe even extend the studies to continue with the ones that have already been passed, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can just give them more money and try to get more information.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Julia. I work in film and media. I'm curious, as you guys move forward with this, like how reliant you are for how media is covering this policy, and what's been helpful and what's been harmful, and like as we move forward, because I know we're gonna have to start reframing the entire narrative of psychedelics, and we're new in the space and just learning how to tell these stories, and what has been super helpful when you guys go in and if you're using, you know, media or sources at all.
Yeah, that's key to passing legislation, making sure. You know, I love the press, you know, and the press that actually will take the story and tell it in the truth. So if you give them a story and you write it for them and they research it, they'll deliver it just like that and add even more value. So I think making sure you take them from A to Z, do editorials, make sure that you do have people that have lived experiences, be able to get interviews with reporters that care about this issue, find reporters that really have had people in their families that actually have benefited from therapy. That's how you're going to be able to get the stories told with passion, and it's going to come out so much better.
I'll say that the press was very helpful to us. When there was a bit of a stall in the process of getting a hearing, we called the press conference at the Capitol, and we had a number of Navy SEALs and Green Berets there behind us. And as I introduced the bill, I had Governor Perry talk a little bit about this topic. And the news crews showed up, and the media showed up. And to their credit, they didn't produce a story that was sensationalized. They didn't hit the old stigma. They were curious, how is this Democrat getting a Republican governor to support his bill? This is a great story. Let's see what's going on. And that educated a lot of folks, and that provided a lot of courage to other members who also wanted to be at that press conference, use that snapshot for their campaign photos. Hey, whatever it takes, you know, I'm easy. And the press helped. But I'm not saying that we used them. I think it was a fantastic partnership because you got out a story that people needed to hear, and they listened.
There's so many people that want to hear those stories. There are so many people. The more and more I'm involved, the more people say, thank you, because I want to come out and be involved in it. I'm using it now, but I want to be able to use it legally.
All right. So just a time check. We have about 6 more minutes. So I think we can fit in 2 more questions.
Hi, my name is Ethan Campion. I'm a lawmaker out of Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm in a state where this issue is advancing very fast, thanks to leaders in your Republican majority. But kind of have 2 questions for you. Number one, what has been the response from the law enforcement community on this? And number 2, how is your advocacy in the state legislature translating to conversations with your federal delegations and U.S. senators?
Yeah.
Okay, so my conversations with law enforcement have actually been largely positive. In my community, I live in the southernmost tip of Texas, so drugs in the area have always been prevalent. But we have rarely had psychedelics down there. And in speaking with them, kind of as an aside, law enforcement says, we never see this problem. I'm just glad you weren't trying to legalize cocaine. So that always helped. But I'll say, because of this legislation, one of the witnesses that spoke at my hearing, Morgan Luttrell, former Navy SEAL, is now a U.S. Congressman, likely motivated by the policymaking process. So he's an advocate at the federal level. Another member who was a very strong co-author of my bill, Jake Elsey, is now a U.S. Congressman, and he is part of that federal coalition. Both Republicans and looking for bipartisan support to push this at the federal level. So yes, at the state level, you can impact at the federal level very easily if things just go the right way and you reach out to the right members that are intellectually curious about this topic.
Yeah. And with law enforcement, the truth that I've learned from law enforcement, they're looking at, one, this is not addictive. Two, they have a different perspective about this compared to cannabis and other drugs. This seems like something that law enforcement could support, but of course they have to follow their oath of office. In Illinois, we do talk to our federal members. I think that they met, or they're planning to meet with Dick Durbin. He's the number 2, and so he's going to be talked to, and we're going to help him understand. Of course, our Congress people, we have a large delegation in Illinois, and we're talking to them as well.
Thanks.
Hi, Steve Rolls from Transform Drug Policy Foundation in the UK. It's great what you're doing with these reforms in the sort of therapeutic medical space, but I'm kind of conscious that the majority of sort of mushroom use is actually in recreational settings, and MDMA overwhelmingly is in recreational settings. But on mushrooms, for example, can you see that there is a possibility for a trajectory, as has happened with medical cannabis leading to a lot of recreational cannabis reforms, that there will be a similar trajectory with magic mushrooms? I mean, I'm conscious that there is sort of this idea of deserving and undeserving psychedelics users, and for me, people using them in recreational settings should have access to safe supply as well. Or is having that discussion maybe a threat to some of the things you're trying to do in the short term with medical use?
So as a policymaker, I'm legitimately concerned about the uneducated using a controlled substance incorrectly and harming themselves or others. Not only is that bad for that individual, but it will really set back the progress that we've made significantly. So I think as we educate ourselves a little bit more, down the road, I do see that being an option, a recreational use. I don't see that right now. I think we still need to learn a lot more. And I say this because look what happened in the 60s and 70s. The stigma of psychedelic misuse back then still affects us today. Where could we have already been if we had been a little bit more cautious in our approach back then? So I don't want my grandchildren to still be waiting for this to be an available treatment. So if that means we have to be a little bit more cautious, I'd rather go that route.
I concur 100%.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Do you have any final closing thoughts? We have a minute and a half left.
Colorado's fantastic. It's like 102 and 80% humidity back home, so I really enjoy it. We can do this all the time.
Well, I just want to thank you. I'm very happy to be a part of the breakthrough, and I encourage Black people to get involved in this issue. This is huge. I think I see none. One doctor. So get involved. This is excellent. Thank you, Tomer, for hosting us. And I see you, doctor.
If I could just say one final thing, this is not meant to be self-serving, but if you know an elected official back home, or you find one really pushing the fight, support them. Send them a letter, send them an email, send them a donation. Tell your friends, like, hey, this person is really going to help us. Because we don't always hear that, and that can really make a difference, just emotionally, like, hey, okay, I'm not just in this by myself. And sometimes when I filed this bill, I had fellow members who were like, crazy, shrooms? So I need you. And I'm sure Representative Ford needs you too. Every state in the union is going to get there if you get involved. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you both.